Good afternoon, everybody. Please, if you're still coming in, come to the front. My name is Rebecca Molyneux, and I'm a business manager within People and Culture here at AMP. I'm going to be your host for this Amplify session, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to AMP board, AMP employees, visitors, guests, members of the press, and those tuning in via the web. Some quick housekeeping before we get going. Amplify is not just a talk fest, but it's a do fest. So we encourage you to participate in conversations through Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and use the hashtag AmplifyFest. You can also download the Amplify app, where you can check into this session, ask your questions, and take and share notes. So today we're going to hear from Heather McGowan on redesigning work, employment, and the social contract. This session will run for approximately 25 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Now, as an AMP employee, I have a great opportunity every other year to attend Amplify, and I admit that as soon as the tickets are available, I'm on the web scouring for talks and things that I'd be interested in, signing up to almost everyone I can. When I look through this year, Heather's profile and talk interested me immediately. I think working within human resources, understanding where innovative thinkers like Heather see jobs and careers going is of real interest to me. When I was lucky enough to be paired with Heather as a buddy, it could be said that I might have started cyber stalking her just a little. I've read all of her blogs, her LinkedIn profile, her Twitter. I've purchased her book, Disrupt Together, How Teams Consistently Innovate. So what did I learn from all of my research? Heather's had a fantastically diverse career, ranging from work as a designer, where she brought more than 25 products to market, including consumer products, healthcare, and toys. She's all the way through to advising the president of the Philadelphia University on the creation of the Kanbar College of Design, Engineering and Commerce, the first undergraduate college focused exclusively on innovation. Heather is, in the true sense of the word, a thought leader. An academic entrepreneur, innovation strategist and visionary, she advises senior executives in corporate and higher education on transformational change. The world of higher education, for example, needs to think differently about preparing graduates for jobs that do not yet exist, for problems that we do not yet know. Heather connects these two corporate and academic realms. An innovation strategist, she has assisted diverse teams in large corporations to focus on the opportunity space and user experience to place a single product or service features and benefits into a more accurate context where new possibilities become not only evident but obvious. Heather also speaks, writes, advises on the convergence of the future of work, collaborative economy, and higher education. Heather's talk today will be focusing on change, income, economy, future, jobs, skills, and what all of this means to you. I think the first line of Heather's blog, "Your resume is irrelevant," is a great introduction. In the present and future, you will not be hired or engaged because of a position you held or a degree that you have, but rather because of the value you can create. So please help me welcome Heather McGowan.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think when it comes to speaker buddies, I might have lucked out with the best one. She's been fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you, Annalee, for having me here. This is my first time in Australia. I'm an American, so this is a new experience on a number of fronts. Are you guys having a good week? Yeah. It's been incredible, hasn't it? I'm honored to be a part of this. So you've heard from many speakers who are subject matter experts. And if you could tell by Rebecca's glowing and humbling bio for me, I'm not a subject matter expert on anything. I'm about as general as you can get. But what I call myself is a synthesizer and a dot connector. And so when I was preparing to make a presentation specifically for you guys, I thought about framing it across a few realms. First, I want to start with a quote from Ray Kurzweil. He's a futurist and also head of engineering at Google. He says we're in a time of such exponential change that it's not going to feel like 100 years, it's going to feel like 20,000 years. He actually just updated this quote to say 100,000 years, so it's actually going even faster. And I want to walk you through some of that change. So we have unprecedented rates of change. It's these tectonic shifts that are taking place. Some of them you may be feeling already, or you may just be hearing about. What this has all done to income equality, or rather inequality, and what that means and how that's enabled certain emerging economies. And what's happened to jobs as a result of this, what skills gaps are emerging from this changes in jobs, and where it could all go from here, and then most importantly, what this all means for you guys, because this is a talk that I made specifically for you. So if you look at change over time, and this comes from Tim Urbane, who talks about how people feel about artificial intelligence. We're on a pathway where you're a place in time you think that maybe some of this change will slow down. Maybe it's not as much as they say it's going to be. Maybe it's going to be okay. But from everything you're hearing about driverless cars and Internet of Things, you know the road's going to bend a little more up, and I'm talking primarily about technological change. But the reality is, we're at the bend in the road where it's right in our face. In the next 5 or 10 years, things are going to change dramatically from what they look like today. I'm going to unpack that in 5 specific dimensions right now. This comes from Ray Kurzweil, which is it's an expansion of Moore's law, and he basically, talking about computing power and how it exponentially changes. And we are at that bend in the road. We're right there. We're in 2045. He says that we're going to have computational power equivalent to all human intelligence. All of our brains in this room and beyond around the globe. We're going to have that moment where biotechnology and nanotechnology merges. He calls it Singularity. And he's created something called Singularity University, which if any of you guys heard from John Hagel, you had the privilege of hearing from one of the professors there. And they're talking about this moment in time where technology and biology merge, and we have the opportunity to solve all of humankind's problems. It's pretty impressive. This comes from Andrew McAfee, who says that productivity, and this is U.S., but it's a good proxy for the rest of the world. U.S. is a pretty good indicator. Our productivity has gone up dramatically. But our employment has not gone up as dramatically. We have a decoupling, and maybe you've heard about some of this. And it started in the 80s, as you can see from that graph, but it really became much more acute in 2000. And the result of this is a lot of technology has replaced a lot of jobs. And a report that came out of Oxford said that 70% of the jobs that we have today will be replaced by the end of this century, and 47% in just in the next 2 decades. We're not ready for this. This comes from Clay Christensen at Innosight, if you guys know Disrupt Innovator's Dilemma. And they looked at companies on the S&P 500. In the 1960s, a company lasted about 65 years on the S&P 500. That's about 15 years today, and it's due to drop to 10 years in the next few years. At this rate, in 2027, 3 out of the 4 companies on the S&P 500 will be companies we haven't even heard of today. And this is an indication of the speed in which businesses are being disrupted. So if we look at the speed in which businesses are being disrupted, let's look at the speed in which they're forming and scaling. In the old economy, it took about 20 years to reach $1 billion valuation. That is compressing dramatically. It takes about 2 years right now for many of the venture-backed startups to reach $1 billion valuation. And to make the point really clear, it's nice to look at Kodak versus Instagram. Both image companies. It took Kodak 74 years to reach $1 billion, and they had 75,000 employees. Instagram was acquired after under 2 years. They had 13 employees with $1 billion valuation. We're getting there faster with far fewer people. So all this technology change, let's look at how we're adopting this technology. This is also comes from Kurzweil. He says this is how much time it took for technologies to reach 25% of households. It's just a way of measuring how quickly we're adopting and integrating technology into our lives. So electricity took 46 years. The telephone took 35 years. Radio took 31. And as you can see, going down and down. To the World Wide Web only took 7 years. Driverless cars might be 15 years. There's some hiccups in that. And when you look at this, another way to ask yourselves this question, I'm going to ask you this guy's question. How many phone numbers, if I handed you a phone without an address book in it, how many people could you call? 1, 5. 10 years ago, how many people could you call? You're already part cyborg. You've already outsourced that part of your brain to a device. So when Ray talks about outsourcing our memories and all that sort of stuff that sounds crazy, you've already done it. I can't get anywhere without a GPS in my car. We've all outsourced. There's different parts of our brain already. Another way I like to bring this home is this simple way of looking at how our mental models and some of our contextual references have changed. So if you look at the evolution of a simple thing like call me, when the phone first came out, which I'm sure is before everybody else in this room, you picked up the handset and it required a human to connect the wires and they said who they were looking for. This might be more familiar to you, a rotary phone. You picked it up, it might have a busy signal, maybe you had a party line, you waited for the rates to go down. Then you had a car phone, it was amazing, you could call somebody in a car, or an answering machine, got home, you were so excited because the light was blinking and someone cared that you were gone. To, pager, this is actually the original BlackBerry, or a flip phone, which we had inconsistent connectivity, to a smartphone that had geolocation and you could send someone a picture of exactly where you were, to real-time FaceTime or Skyping, and to my watch my watch beeped right when I came up here to tell me I was speaking next. That's a bit of redundant technology. But if you look at this, all the dots are on this end. A lot of the changes happened in the last few years, and I think those dots are going to be even closer together if we look out the next 5 or 10 years. So that simple contextual reference of call me, what is for you guys, what does banking mean? It may no longer involve a bank. What does driving mean when you may no longer be the driver? So we're having these shifting contextual references as well, which is important to keep in mind. So just to recap the 5 key mentions, we talked about the speed of computing power. We talked about productivity and rising automation, which is decoupling human consumers and producers. We got rapid industry disruption cycles from the S&P 500. We've got accelerated company scaling. Companies will reach $1 billion much faster with far fewer people. And we have expedited adoption of technology. Now let's look at what this has done to income, wages, income inequality. I'm going to first use one from the US. So this is the US. It's that same decoupling of productivity and employment. But then you look at, that's what our top 1% has got in gains in the US. A lot of the 90-some-odd% of the gains since the recession in 2008 went to the top 1%. And if we look at that, I don't know how many of you guys have heard of the Gini coefficient, but very simply, Gini coefficient, if there are 100 people in this room and I have all the resources, then the Gini coefficient is 1. It's absolute inequality. If there are 100 people in this room and everybody has 1/100th of the resources, then the Gini coefficient is 0, absolute equality. So let's look at the three, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. All of us are experiencing increasing inequality on a global scale. And we've had 2 distinct reactions to that, which I think are interesting. The first was the Occupy movement, which sought to dismantle the top 1% and redistribute those resources. Many would argue that the Occupied effort so far has been just to raise awareness. They haven't actually gotten anywhere yet, but it's the first shot across the bow. And the second reaction has been the collaborative economy, where out of need, more people have done more with less, access over ownership. They've tapped the contingent workforce to give people more opportunity to do more with the things they have to monetize their assets. So if we look at the collaborative economy, really simply, you've got 5 or 6 different types of value, from goods to services to specialized skills to commodity skills. And you have platform owners, and the platforms really hold the information, the reputation, and the payment systems, and the platform owners just transaction skim. So they can scale much quicker because the buyers and sellers are connected through a platform as opposed to a company, and the platform owners are rising up much more quickly because they're transaction skimming on this. So how did this come about? If you start with the web, that gave us connectivity driven by productivity. Then we had the ability to communicate through social media. Then now we have the ability to collaborate through social mobile, and the convergence is coming next. And that's going to be the intersection of the singularity that Ray Kurzweil was talking about, also the 6th wave. I think you're going to have James Moody is talking either later today or tomorrow, the author of the 6th wave. And that's driven by a desire for resource efficiency. If you look at income inequality in the U.S., this is a U.S. figure, which is that 48% of college graduates right now in the U.S. are working in jobs that don't require a degree. So they're taking all that debt, they're taking all that time, and they're not getting jobs that require their degree. You guys, the number I had heard is 4 months after graduation. I think you've got something like 30% still unemployed, so that's the figure I could find for you guys. We have a rising contingent workforce. For you guys, it's 25%, thereabouts. For us, it's somewhere between 30 and 40%, and this is germane because how do you get them to sign up for their superannuation if they're contingent workers? I mean, that's a reality I think you guys are all facing. So if we look at asset pies, at one point in time you had a job, you had home equity, you had savings, and for us it's pension and Social Security. For you it's Social Security and superannuation. Now that is gig income, smaller amounts of home equity, fewer people owning homes, and for those who do own homes, there's less equity in it. Smaller savings, and then the pension is now a 401k, so it went from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, with large gaps that people are filling with the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, or gig income. And I think this is relevant because if you saw Stephanie's talk this morning, there's more of a scarcity mindset out there than an abundance mindset. So how do you approach that when you're trying to sell them retirement products? So we looked at 5 key factors: rising income inequality, occupy and collaborate, rising contingent workforce, graduate and youth underemployment, and the asset and gaps. So now let's look at skills. The old economy, it used to look like this. You were educated for 20 some odd years. Then you had this band of career that lasted 45 or so years. And then you had this defined moment where you got your pension. And you didn't live to 100, you lived to 70 maybe. And this was a far easier time, I would imagine, to sell your superannuation because you signed people up when they became employees. And whether they stayed in the same company or the same industry, they sort of stayed in a channel where they drew off their education. Jobs have now moved in 3 directions. They've moved up, requiring higher skill level, more education, and there are fewer of these because we don't need as many of them. They've moved out where they've been outsourced to history, and there's been a lot more of that. And then they've been spread across the globe between an intersection of globalization and technology where jobs can be broken into job fragments that can be done anywhere, and this is our rising contingent workforce. So the job reality now, I think, looks like this, which is intersecting bands of engagement, learning and leverage in rapid cycles, and the reality of longevity, which both Ruth and Elizabeth are going to talk about tomorrow with how to tap our aging workforce and how to consider them more of an asset than a liability, which I think is a nice framing. So when you look at the safety nets that used to be there, we had 3 bands. We had the safety net, we had learn, and then you contributed. And the market demand for talent was pretty consistent. In the U.S., if you had if you had a degree, you had a job, essentially. There was enough demand. And the workforce development needs were largely contained in that period of time in which you got your degree. And life looked like this. You were educated, you contributed, then you retired. And the safety net was there for health, disability, et cetera. And now it looks much more like this. Does this look familiar to you guys? How do you engage people in thinking about their retirement when their life is this rapid cash flow cycle? So we had 3 considerations in the job area: new paradigm and expectations, job movement, and then this need for a new type of social contract, one that allows the contingent workforce, one that allows the collaborative economy to offer innovative ways to let people work flexibly, but offers them some protections. Right now, there's no protections for that group. So looking next at the skills, this comes from MIT, a great report called Dances with the Robots, and they look at the workforce development skills over the last 30, 40 years. No surprise, manual tasks have been on the decline, but also the surprising thing is anything routine cognitive, but routine is also on the decline and has been since the 80s. And the real workforce development skills are unstructured problems and working with new information. Anything mentally or physically routine can and will eventually be automated. And that isn't just simply putting parts together in a car. That's finance. That's law. That's medicine. I mean, that's a lot of the programs at the universities I work at, what they're building for the future. So this comes a lot of one of Ken Robinson's talks inspired me to put this together. And if we look about how we train people, we have a continuum of convergence intelligence, solving problems, one correct answer; divergence intelligence, opening up a problem frame, thinking about it differently, thinking about many possible solutions; cognitive intelligence, IQ; social emotional intelligence. And if you look at kindergarten, which is right-brained, we work on social emotional development, we work on exploration, and I also put Montessori in there because it's notable the founders of Wikipedia, Amazon, Google, and many others all went to Montessori school, which I think is an interesting take on our education system. And if you look where education's moved, certainly in the US, it's been very focused on cognitive intelligence and convergent thinking. What can we test? What can we know? And as a result of it, you can see that the US education system is tanking around the world. It's not working because the workforce development demands critical thinking, which is a balance between convergent, divergent thinking and social emotional intelligence, because problems don't break down anymore to subcomponents. You have to work collaboratively on teams to solve complex problems, and that requires social emotional intelligence. So for those of you as a parent in the room, I think this might be most interesting to you. I don't think people can, this came out of my your resume is irrelevant thought process. You can't think of yourself anymore, here's my resume, because here's what I did. It's what are you going to do, which is a combination of what are your assets and capabilities, what can you uniquely do, What are the market realities? How do they value those assets and capabilities? And the other important piece is your values. What's your passion? What is it that you're excited about? Collectively, that's your competitive advantage. That's your offering. So you have to figure out how to define that. And then you have to go out and say, what's my brand? How am I communicating that offering to the world? And then how am I cultivating my network, connecting with other people who can help me advance my brand and advance my offerings? So I don't know if how many of you guys are familiar with Reid Hoffman and his book, The Network Alliance, or he wrote an article, Towards the Duty, which covers the same stuff. He says there are 3 types of employees where we've always kind of thought about one employee. We kind of thought about an employee like if you thought about dating and marrying the first person you date. We hire people, and then we have this horrible day when we have to let them go. And we never talk about, I want this person here for this amount of time to do this job, and then they could go do another job within the company, or they could do something else. We have this very sort of finite view of employment. So he says there are these 3 bands, and I think there are actually 5 types of talent. So you start with foundational, which is that marrying type, and it may be all of you guys in this room. If you look at Cheryl's talk, the people in the company are now the brand. These are your foundational people. So if you look at a place like Apple, it's Steve Jobs and it's Johnny Ives. They embody the brand. You want them there long term. You want to invest in them. They're going to build and sustain the entity. The next type is rotational, and you probably have a lot of rotational people you haven't had honest conversations with. It's an entry-level job. It's a management training job. They should be there for a certain number of years, and then they should move into another job, or they should go away, because you shouldn't have to pay any more for somebody to do the same job. So they make incremental contributions, but you know what they're going to be. Then there's the contingent workforce, which can be like hiring a tool. And it could be at a very high level, like a lawyer or a financial advisor, or it could be at a lower level, like somebody who answers the telephone, depending on the level of skill that you want. But you know what you're hiring. You're hiring a tool. It could be hours, days, months, years. The third type, this is the type that Hoffman recognizes, and it's one I identify with because it's kind of what I do. It's a short-term gig where you go into an organization, whether you're internal or you're a consultant. You're there for 3 to 5 years, and you're there specifically to make a state change. You're transformational. And when you're done, you go away and do it somewhere else, and you bring in a team who can either continue on the strategic plan or continue to execute. And then I think this is a type that I've added, and I'm not sure if Annalee's still in the room, but I think Annalee is a great example of this, an executive producer, somebody who spends all their time cultivating a network. They can bring them together for an event like today. Like AMP has really invested in being a learning organization. You repeatedly have these events, and Annalee spends her time scaling the globe for different types of people who can bring new thoughts to you. But it isn't limited to just a convention. It could also be you want to launch a new product, you hire somebody who's got a vast network of people who can come in, build that new product, get it off the ground. The executive producer is, I think, another role. And you have to think about whether you want these people internal to your company, you want them external. And if you saw John Hagel's talk, how do you connect to them as sort of a business ecosystem? So where does this all going from here? PricewaterhouseCoopers is one of your sponsors, and if you saw Stuart's talk, it's silly to think of the future as a finite point in which you identify. So they identify a few different futures, and they say it can go on 2 axes. One is which are we going to remain individuals, every person for themselves? Or are we going to develop more of a collective thought towards society, looking out for the good of all? Is the power in organizations going to remain integrated into large organization, or is it going to become fragmented into smaller special organizations that are in an ecosystem? And they say within that there are 3 worlds. The blue world, where corporate is king, it's more big companies, the companies are even bigger. The people who succeed as employees in the companies, they're the winners. The green world, where it is still incorporated into big companies, but social responsibility and environmentalism and resource efficiency is their priority. Or the orange world, where they say small is beautiful, where it's a network of ecosystems of specialized labor. So when we look at collaborative economy and platforms in terms of these 3 different worlds, I think there's some nice parallels. I am all for the collaborative economy. I think you've had Jeremiah Oyang and Rachel Botsman both at former Amplify events. I am a big supporter of the collaborative economy, but I don't think all platforms are the same. And I think we have to think very carefully about what these platforms do for us. So if you look at Etsy, Etsy helps buyers and sellers of fine arts goods connect with people around the world. Airbnb helps you find a house or an apartment anywhere around the world, and Uber is your private driver. If you look at their valuations, Etsy just went public at 3.5. Airbnb just closed out at 20 billion. Uber's at 50 billion. If you look at their fees, Etsy's remained the same, Airbnb's remained the same. Interestingly, every time Uber raises money, it raises fees on their drivers. When they were below 13 billion, they took 5%. Then when they got to 20 billion, they took 20%. And now that they're closing in on 50 billion, they're taking 30% in the US, which I think is interesting. What kind of support do they offer? The platform, what kind of support do they offer the community? Etsy reserved 5% of their stock, and they said we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the artists. So we're going to share the equity in our going public. Airbnb has services. Some of them are for a fee. They do photography for people, and they host these annual summits. So they help their hosts become more successful. And Uber can offer you a car if you want to finance it through them. Some notable things is Etsy is committed to being a certified B Corporation, which means they commit to social environmental audits. They commit, even if there's a change in control like going public, they won't leave their values behind. Airbnb has done these Airbnb Open Summits where they spend a lot of time cultivating their relationship with hosts to make them more successful. And Uber has hired engineers away from Carnegie Mellon with a desire to replace all of its drivers with self-driving cars. I love Uber, but... So, just to wrap up, what does this all mean to you? What about your principles? What does this mean for us as a society? And I just want to kick these off to prompt questions for you guys. As parents, what should you do about your kids? Policy, what do we need as a society, and what will it take to get there, to make some policy changes? Principles, those of you who own your own companies, how do I offer services to this changing workforce? And then providers, how do I offer benefits like the folks from A&P? So that wraps up my talk with 2 minutes to spare.